Hi there. My name is Shawn Fennell, and I am part of a mapping misinformation special work group that is taking place. That was conducted here at the University of Rhode Island. My colleagues, who you will be mostly hearing from, Kate Sylvester, Mary Lynn, Juliet Waromi, and Lawrence Smith. I don't think I did that in alphabetical order, but anyway, we will be presenting for you today a sort of kaleidoscopic view on misinformation, the state of misinformation today, as a sort of social, psychological phenomenon, and also within the broader political context. So let's get started.
Today we are presenting Mapping Misinformation, which looks at the effects and corrections of false information. To best map misinformation, we need to be able to see how and why it forms. Misinformation forms when there is a compatibility with other known information, credibility of the source, whether others believe it, whether the information is internally consistent, whether there is supporting evidence, and an increased acceptance to the material that is easily comprehensible, as stated by an overt source. Now, why does it form? Some reasons are that it is a political response, that there is a lack of awareness and/or motivated reasoning. When I say lack of awareness, it means an unintentional negligence. Since some individuals haven't had racial inequality experiences, it is harder for them to believe it. Motivated reasoning suggests that it coincides with prior biases.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about why misinformation spreads so easily. So the first reason for why it spreads so easily is the novelty of falsehoods was found in a study done at MIT. So false info generates surprise and disgust, as opposed to correct information generating things like sadness and anticipation and stuff like that. And the more one is exposed to false information, the more likely they are to become susceptible to false information in the future. It also builds on pre-existing sentiments, and people on the internet who are trolls or bots on the internet are spreading misinformation far more than they are spreading correct information. And there's also the phenomenon of confirmation bias. You're going to seek out things that support what you already believe to be true. So here we just have a diagram showing kind of how misinformation spreads and some of the different, I guess, people who share misinformation. So there's some people who support it, who spread information in support of a person or a cause, people who share it unintentionally or just kind of scrolling through and might not realize that something's fake. There's people who deliberately share it to cause harm or because they think it's a joke or whatever. There's a lot of different types of people who are spreading misinformation. So why is misinformation so prevalent? Why are these beliefs so strongly held? So these beliefs are held with very strong conviction, and people will believe that they're the best informed on the subject, regardless of whether or not that's actually the case. Another reason is that it's also difficult to correct misinformation. It needs to fill the gaps, not be super complicated, and provide alternative explanations. And because that's difficult to do, misinformation continues to be prevalent. And finally, cultural worldviews and values differ based on political affiliation. So that also, that's also another reason why misinformation is so prevalent. As I mentioned before, retraction is difficult. There's also the phenomenon of motivated skepticism, where participants express active skepticism to information that does not align with their worldview. There's different emphasis on values based on political beliefs. For example, liberals tend to place more value on harm prevention and equality than conservatives do, which will impact the information that they believe. So in this presentation, we're going to be talking about the spread of misinformation related to COVID-19, specifically COVID-19 vaccines and critical race theory. Because of its exponential growth, finding quality information on the internet is similar to a nightmare. The fast-changing nature of information resources has made the evaluation of the trustworthiness of information a crucial task, especially when false information is being posted on the web. In our presentation, we evaluate two major trends that have become a new bogeyman for people unwilling to acknowledge the impact on their lives. The spread of misinformation on COVID-19 and attacks on critical race theory have both become such flashpoints in our lives. It is important to understand the psychodynamics of misinformation around them. To fully understand the psychology of vaccine hesitancy, we looked at vaccine conspiracy theories.
So we begin with some of the more innocuous and potentially feasible theories, as you can see here. The notions that, generally speaking, they group under the two camps of deliberately causing harm or deliberately or accidentally causing harm or complications, and also which generally speak, and also sort of the long-term consequences or questions regarding the origin. These, of course, under the particular circumstances, are somewhat more understandable because there is a gap in our information because they are relatively new and were brought to market relatively quickly, or were researched relatively quickly. But then, of course, those aren't exclusively the ones on the sort of the market. The sort of vaccine conspiracy space has opened up and included certain gems, such as the notion that the vaccine will turn people into crocodiles, bearded ladies, vampires, in league with Satan, or potted plants.
So we're going to talk a little bit now about how conspiracy theories contribute to vaccine hesitancy. So first of all, was there vaccine hesitancy before the spread of misinformation about COVID vaccines? Yeah, absolutely. The practices of inoculation and variolation, which were precursors to vaccines, have been used for many years in the Middle East and China before going to Europe in the 18th century. And there have always been people weary of vaccines and against government mandates. So in the early days of vaccinations, there was poor sanitizing of equipment and there were strange devices that would make people more hesitant. Jumping forward, excuse me, to modern times, in the late 1990s, a physician named Andrew Wakefield in the UK did a study of 12 children with MMR vaccines, and his findings were that these vaccines were linked to autism, and this study has been widely discredited due to manipulated data, and there's been no link found between vaccines and autism. However, a media frenzy around the findings gave it credibility and helped fan the flames of anti-vax sentiments. Sorry. There's a long history of opposing vaccination mandates as well. In Britain, there was a group formed called the Anti-Vaccination League in response to the country trying to mandate smallpox vaccines. And in the case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905, a man named Henning Jacobson refused to get vaccinated and refused to pay a fine, and the Supreme Court ruled against him. So that is kind of the legal basis in the United States for vaccine mandates. So does misinformation increase vaccine hesitancy? Yes, I gave the example in the previous slide of the MMR vaccine causing autism. There was also misinformation about a smallpox vaccine several hundred years ago that it would turn you into a cow. So vaccine conspiracy theories and misinformation are not a new phenomenon. There are other things that determine vaccine hesitancy as well, including having a lack of confidence in the vaccine and mistrusting the benefits of it and having a lower perceived seriousness of COVID-19. There are also socio-demographic and psychological determinants, including right-wing affiliation, having a higher risk propensity, and having had less negative mental health effects during the pandemic. There's also skepticism regarding the effectiveness of the scientific method. For example, 86% of Democrats with, quote, high levels of scientific knowledge say that it produces accurate conclusions, with 52% of low science knowledge Democrats saying the same. However, science knowledge has little bearing on Republicans' beliefs about the scientific method. Also, trust in medical practitioners is higher than that of researchers, but skepticism is still widespread nonetheless. Being involved and engaged on social media is also a pretty big factor in determining whether or not you're going to be hesitant to get a vaccine. Anti-vaxxers on social media tend to use more emotional language, share more conspiracy theories, and are generally more engaged as a group. And then peer-to-peer communication, there's very strong ingrained beliefs, and you're more likely to believe what your peers are saying if they're all saying the same thing. So while there is a party divide, Democrats are more likely to get this vaccine than Republicans. This divide disappears when accounting for income and education. And it turns out that the real vaccination divide is class. And that's a direct quote from a New York Times piece that I've cited here. People are unlikely to trust institutions that do little for them. And because public health is no longer a collective endeavor, that trust has gone down. Governments have, quote, slashed budgets and privatized basic services such as healthcare. Health in this country is treated as a commodity. The government doesn't ensure people's well-being. For example, industries such as self-help and health foods have been built on the principle that good health is, the key to good health lies in you as an individual making good choices. But for people who faced multiple threats such as homelessness, poor housing, food insecurity, poverty, community danger, COVID-19 is only one of many grave threats, and there's skepticism of institutions that have long abandoned them and are suddenly trying to help them. So for example, there was an offer in New York City for municipal workers to get $500 to get the COVID vaccine, but people are wondering why they're offering money for this, but not for other basic needs. And there's also the fact that private healthcare systems, such as the one in the United States, produce not only worse health outcomes than public health systems, but also create segregated care where people are not getting the same healthcare and same quality of healthcare. So when people feel more supported by social programs, they're more likely to trust institutions and believe they have a stake in both their health and that of society. So for example, post-World War II, vaccination rates were very high. There's a lot of social programs and government funding for health initiatives, including in communities of color and poor communities, but that is not the case anymore. And finally, mistrust in media and other institutions is another factor leading to vaccine hesitancy. If you don't feel represented or supported in the media, why are you going to trust that institution? So an example of this is that conservatives don't see themselves represented in the news media and hold the belief that news organizations are liberal and that they don't want them there, so they are less likely to believe any information coming from that space because they don't feel represented.
So as we heard about what is misinformation, and also we also heard about some of the conspiracy theories, now I want to bring your attention to how actually the misinformation can affect the level of trust in government healthcare system. So these are the factors that contribute to the fact that why people, they are not having a strong trust in government healthcare institution. So as we know that during the pandemic of COVID-19, people already feel that the government is failed to bring back the number of cases of COVID-19. And we also know that when it comes to the vaccine distribution, also people feel hesitate because of how the misinformation spread, and people hesitate to take the vaccine because, again, they see the government actually fail, and people also see that there's a government officials that are corrupted, and there are history aspect that also one of the factor that really affect the level of trust in government healthcare system, that is there's a history of inequality that happens, and there is also that people in general believe that it takes 10 years for the vaccine to be really eligible to get tested on the people. And there are actually two countries that is outside the US that we look specifically about how really misinformation can affect their healthcare system. The first one is Brazil, and in Brazil they have a part of Brazilian national healthcare system. It's called Anvisa, and they work together with the Chinese government, and they guide about and they got the Sinovac vaccine, and they wanted to be tasted to 9,000 Brazilians. And as we know that how misinformation have been spread um, about the vaccine theories, that there is some sort of medical biology that biology weapon that is kind of, people tend to believe that is coming from China. So there's some sort of protest that is going on in Brazil, and here's the example that the protests happen. People, they protest because they believe that the government actually corrupt, and they some sort of like emotional that is derived, that derive the people so that they conduct the protest. And here's the second protest that I think that is interesting to be look at it, because this protest happened because as a response that the lady right here, because the government, the official, actually the President Jair Bolsonaro actually said something that is most of us that believe as a misinformation. He said that Pfizer uh, vaccine actually can turn people into alligators. So this kind of statement that is coming out from um, government officials really affect how people react to the vaccine, how really affect their hesitant to take the vaccine. And yeah, the lady right here, she said that she proudly wore a crocodile costume, and she kind of wears it because she believes that the administration, they're having lack in bringing the effective vaccine to the people. So when she said about effective vaccine, she's kind of referring to uh, Sinovac vaccine that most of Brazilians, including her, they believe that there is less effective than the other vaccine. And the other country that we take a look is New Zealand, as we know that New Zealand is one of the countries that is doing very well in decreasing the number of COVID-19 cases. However, when it comes to vaccine distribution, New Zealand also faced the same struggle with the with with some other countries. So again, the healthcare institution, it's called Ministry of Health, and they got vaccine distribution that is coming from UK, from the US, which is Pfizer, Biotech, AstraZeneca. And they're actually interesting about New Zealand is they have one study that is done in last year, in which there are two things that is very important to how and how government can use it as a strategies to for the vaccine distribution. The first one is they're telling people that based on scientific reasons that people should not worry to take the vaccine because it's going to minimize the spread of COVID-19 cases. And the second one is it's going to minimize the disease in the total high risk population, there's uh, because there's also a different historical access in healthcare system that is happening in New Zealand. So Maori people, for example, they're the one that is really affected by the spread of COVID-19 by the virus. And here's also similar with Brazil, that there's also protest that is going on. And this protest is about, this is about anti-COVID-19 vaccine protest, which is very interesting with what we're doing, because this is how really misinformation can lead people to protest. And the protest based on one of the conspiracy theories that world leaders and powerful people are secretly using vaccines to commit a genocide, and they believe that because of that, the government official, they should put it on trial. So this kind of misinformation is very dangerous, and that's why they people that is protesting, they they really want the Prime Minister Jacinda to put it on the trial, because again, this kind of misinformation leads to believe that Jacinda, the Prime Minister, is the one that is responsible for the many deaths of New Zealanders. So now I want to bring your attention to also look at how the government affords to tackle the facts and misinformation. So there are two actually ways that can be used. The one is about provide scientific studies about vaccine evolution, so people know where is it coming from, why is it created, and what is it using for. And the second one is the government, how they tackle the misinformation is they develop an effective vaccine, a vaccine that people can believe and they can take it, so they can be safe, and the other people around them can be safe as well. And here's one of the examples that has been done by New Zealand Ministry of Health website, that in their website, their healthcare system website, they have a bunch of information about the vaccine evolution, the scientific studies behind the vaccine, but also down the website, they have specific box right there that is kind of bring the people to know what is the misinformation and what is the information that they can have it. So there's the box that says getting the right information matters, which is, I think that is very interesting, and in how, for example, New Zealand government, they tackle misinformation.
So Mary and Juliet have both offered some state level analyses regarding COVID disinformation. And we will shortly be hearing something on the hyper-local level regarding CRT, critical race theory, and its impact, and the permutation of that discussion here in Rhode Island. For a moment, however, I'd like to latch on to something that Mary mentioned in her analysis regarding sort of the institutional context in the United States that allowed for an environment which fed the fire of misinformation, created the potential for misinformation to spread more effectively. I'd like to take a look at that sort of structural dilemma from another perspective, which is, say, the international perspective. In particular, I'd like to take a look at the opening salvos of the public health response internationally, where the WHO was concerned, to take a look at those initial moments to see if they tell us something about the sort of international structures and how the international structures have sort of also may have created a context for misinformation and disinformation to spread more readily. So some things that it is important to know about the World Health Organization is basically that it's a federated system, and each of these levels, both the headquarter levels as well as 6 regional offices, most notably for our purposes, the Western Pacific Office, which liaises with the country office in China and with the Chinese government, that they all have some amount of institutional autonomy, and that includes having separate messaging. So there's a headquarters Twitter account, and then there is also a Western Pacific Twitter account, and they don't always tweet the same stuff, for instance. It is also useful to note the particular parameters of the WHO's sort of mission and the things that they are empowered to do. And just based on the sort of the list that I've placed up, you'll notice that most of it takes place with the sort of consent and approval and cooperation of course, state governments. Because of course, we are looking at here a principal-agent situation, where a principal, which is to say a collective principal, which is the various states involved, basically empower an agent to a certain extent to perform a set of functions. But of course, the agent in that situation now has their own particular motives, their own particular interests, and the principals have their own particular motives, which is to say, the leaders of states want their own, to ensure their own survival, and so might be hesitant to cooperate with the agent who wants to, generally speaking, expand their sort of their ambit of power and to secure funding and secure their own survival. And so, if we take a look at, these are the opening moments and the opening, this is the opening act of the sort of COVID pandemic response. We noticed that at the very end of 2019, there was the initial media statement regarding, I believe it was referred to as several cases of viral pneumonia. On the first of the year, the WHO headquarters filed an initial information request. You'll notice that there is a gap of 3 days wherein China information was requested from China, and the official response from the Chinese state. So we can only imagine the impact that those 3 days had on the sort of the spread of the virus, and also note that information vacuum also has a continuing effect, because of course the Western Pacific office relies upon and basically echoes a Chinese statement that the number of cases has been reduced, or the number of cases that they believe were related had been reduced. You'll also see in the conversation in the subsequent week or so regarding the possibility of human-to-human transmission of this viral pneumonia, evidencing a somewhat sort of some communication problems and some ambiguities. So we have a kind of low information environment, because of course at a press briefing, an epidemiologist at the headquarters said that human-to-human transmission is possible. But later that day, the WHO headquarters Twitter account tweeted that no clear evidence existed of human-to-human transmission. Western Pacific office later tweets, "Good progress is being made." But then, of course, as the gravity of the situation becomes ever more readily apparent, it becomes necessary for the Western Pacific office to hedge and say there's limited evidence of human-to-human transmission. And then there's at least some human-to-human transmission, but of course, as we know now, there was significant human-to-human transmission. And finally, we can see the way in which that low information environment also led the WHO itself to delay the mobilization of their institutional mechanisms, which primarily rely upon the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern. As you can see, on the 23rd of January, a panel of independent experts advised the Director General that the information was insufficient to declare an emergency at that time. And of course, it was an extra week, and only after there was a senior WHO delegation visit to Beijing to sort of do a fact-finding mission in person that public health emergency of international concern was declared. And you can see in the sort of the current snapshot of the current information environment, the seeds of how the seeds of sort of disinformation may have been planted, because of course you can see how in that principal agent interaction in the sort of low information environment that it created, you laid the foundation for the sort of the lab origin theory, which is to say that rather than zoonotic transmission in a market in Wuhan, that it was created by the Chinese government in a lab or what have you. So in conclusion, I guess we can just say that the WHO has some problems that need to be sorted out. Relies on information from member countries, and so it relies on sort of state incentives. In addition, the responsibility of the WHO has grown, but its budget has become less flexible because it primarily depends upon voluntary contributions, which are earmarked for specific initiatives, again, that reliance upon the state's apparatus. And the states, of course, any state would have its own political motives for example, withholding information. However, it must be noted that it cannot be exclusively attributable to the structures, this misinformation environment, because of course we can take a look at the AIDS epidemic in the mid to late 80s, which also had brought with it an initial sort of fog of war, a set of low certainty information conditions. And there are a number of different places because of the different parties concerned that may provide explanations for that misinformation half-life which we saw emerge. In the case of the AIDS epidemic, granted we're significantly further along in dealing with that particular virus, we see the misinformation sort of continuing to live on primarily in sub-Saharan Africa in sort of folk and lay theories, whereas interestingly the misinformation ecosystem for COVID is largely in the global north.
Now that we have mapped misinformation on COVID-19 and its vaccines, let's move on to mapping critical race theory. While the word critical race theory, commonly called CRT, is a charged word, it is hard to define. First, CRT is a verb, not a noun. That means that it isn't as cut and dry as we would hope, but instead more flexible. The best way I found to define it was from the American Bar Association, which states, it critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. CRT also recognizes that race intersects with other identities, including sexuality, gender identity, and others. CRT recognizes that racism is not a bygone relic of the past. Instead, it acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. The reason it is so well defined by the ABA is because prior to the introduction of the K-12 education system, CRT was usually taught in law schools. The controversy on CRT began when it was taught in CRT public education systems. CRT was formed mainly in the 70s, but continued in the 80s and 90s. The originators are Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Cheryl Harris, Richard Delgado, Patricia Williams, Gloria Latson Billings, and Tara Yoso. While the theory was formed early on, it wasn't always called CRT. Later in its formation, the term critical race theory was formed by Kimberly Crenshaw. While CRT has been around for many years, it was until August 2019 that it became well known. Its infamy began when Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project author, published in the New York Times Magazine about this 1619 Project book. The 1619 Project talks about when around 24 slaves came to America in the 1619 and elaborates on why this event is significant in correspondence to the formation of our country. One notable point is where there was an increase in controversy over CRT is in September 2020, when former President Donald Trump is talking about CRT and the 1619 Project in regards to it being toxic propaganda and a form of child abuse in the truest sense of those words. He also stated that it was meant to shame students for America's history. He concluded this discussion by signing an executive order to stop all anti-bias training that depends on CRT for content in all federal agencies. The idea for this executive order is due to Christopher Rufo and his definition of CRT as being a revolutionary program that would overturn the principles of the Declaration and destroy the remaining structure of the Constitution. After the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd protests, there was a push to incorporate race more into the K-12 curriculum. Later, it became CRT in 12 curriculums. When this education reform began, its founding aspects wasn't to be CRT, but to increase racial awareness. The words race and CRT now become synonymous with each other. Because of this, CRT ended up being the center of attention. Now that we have the overall beginning of CRT and its controversy, let's bring it down to a more local level and see when the discussion started in Rhode Island and the misinformation that followed. It seems both the conversation of CRT and the beginning of misinformation began in a bill, a Rhode Island bill, called 2021 H6070, presented by Representatives Patricia Morgan, George Nardone, and Sherry Roberts, that was meant to ban teaching divisive concepts, also known as CRT. Some examples of misinformation prevalent in this bill are that individuals should be responsible and have psychological distress for their race and sex and what their race or sex have done in the past. Also, that ideologies like meritocracy and having a hard work ethic were formed to oppress a race by a particular race and be racist and sexist. The bill was never passed. Since there was misinformation in the bill, which started the CRT conversation in Rhode Island, any further conversations were an increased likelihood to contain said misinformation, specifically for those in favor of the bill. The next event in Rhode Island on CRT is when Wakefield mom, Nicole Solis, requested any material in the South Kingston School Department that pertained to CRT, 1619 Project, systematic racism, white privilege, and gender theory that would be taught to her kindergarten daughter. She was met with some resistance because of the large quantity request and was giving a hefty processing fee of $74,000. The Goldwater Institute is working with Ms. Solis, and on Ms. Solis's behalf stated that this 4,954 hours estimated from the South Kingston School Department was an example that there was divisive concepts being taught in the school system. One aspect that I found that shows the misinformation in Ms. Solis's argument is that, quote, equity is critical race theory code word for discrimination based on race. Because of the commotion seen at the school committee with Ms. Solis, she wasn't allowed to attend these meetings anymore. She was later served with a lawsuit from NERI, as well as a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction from NERI and NEASC. NERI is the overall Rhode Island Teachers Union, and NEASC is the South Kingston Teachers Union. And as you can see here, she made these tweets. The one on the left is pertaining to the restraining order, and the one on the left is the lawsuit, and the one on the right is the restraining order. Another topic of discussion is Providence Middle School teacher, also whistleblower, Ramona Bessinger. She stated how the curriculum material changed to have an oppressor and oppressive narrative. She also mentioned that since this curriculum change, the students and coworkers have been hostile to her. Ms. Bessinger stated that the new curriculum is racially divisive, hateful, and in large part historically inaccurate. The main point of misinformation on this phrase is that it is historically inaccurate. The only reason I am not categorizing the other aspects as misinformation is because she stated that she felt the repercussions of the new curriculum in these ways. Next on is Westerly resident Robert Charidia, is another individual who is promoting misinformation on CRT. He was able to show the teachings of CRT in Westerly Public Schools through requests like Ms. Solis's. Some information that he uses in arguments against CRT is that it is Marxist, which is commonly referred to communism and socialism, and that it is a political agenda of the left. Lastly, remember Representative Patricia Morgan, one of the individuals who introduced the anti-CRT bill? Well, she landed herself in some hot water when she stated that she lost a Black friend to CRT. She had no proof of this reasoning because this said friend is now hostile, but at one point just stopped answering her. Representative Morgan faced bipartisan backlash, and Black Lives Matter Rhode Island Political Action Committee requested she be removed from her state House committees. Let's now review what misinformation was stated on the local level. The misinformation shown in the bill is that individuals should be responsible and have psychological distress for their race or sex and what their race or sex has done in the past. Also, that ideologies like meritocracy and having hard work ethic were formed to oppress a race by a particular race and be racist and sexist. Next, Ms. Solis states that equity is critical race theory code word for discrimination on race. Ms. Bessinger states that the new curriculum in the province public school system is historically inaccurate. Mr. Chiridio says that CRT is Marxist and a political agenda of the left. And lastly, Representative Patricia Morgan said she lost a Black friend to CRT.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what can be done to combat misinformation. So one of the things that can be done is targeting behavior changes directly. So an example of this would be if you wanted to decrease alcohol consumption, raising taxes on alcohol, rather than sending out messaging like, hey, drink less. But if you raise the taxes, people are going to be less likely to spend money and continue drinking a ton. Another example of this is an opt-out rather than opt-in organ donation program. So things like that, targeting the behavior changes rather than targeting the information. Second is framing the information in a way that's consistent with the person's worldview. This is kind of called cultural cognition theory. So an example would be if you're trying to convince someone who's more conservative about the dangers of climate change and wanted them to put a carbon tax into place, you could reframe it by calling it a carbon offset rather than a carbon tax. So reframing it in a way that's consistent with their worldview. And third would be having someone with a similar worldview presenting the new information. So back to the climate change example, having one person who's conservative speak to another person who's conservative with the correct information about climate change.
Another way to combat misinformation as a whole is to debunk after the information has already spread. Another way is also pre-bunking, which this means that before the information can get out, you prevent it, such as providing information when we have Facebook posts that are seen as factually inaccurate. It provides a warning that the information contained in this is inaccurate, and they will cite the sources that makes it show that the inaccuracy of it. Lastly, another way to be able to combat misinformation is to encourage people to really look at the truth in what is being said and not take it at face value. And many individuals sometimes will listen to close friends because that's what they trust, but the best and most reliable information is the one you do yourself, and you do it thoroughly. And if you do it thoroughly, you'll be able to get to the truth of any information. In a specific sense for CRT, while this can be done in an overall sense, I feel that it is most movable in the CRT aspect in the local level of testimonies. This is because there was over 150 individuals who wrote testimonies against their Rhode Island CRT bill. And by doing this, they were able to help counteract the misinformation presented in the bill. Amelia Moore, who is a professor of marine affairs here at the University of Rhode, was one of the many who submitted written testimonies against the bill. As quote, she said, critical race theory is an interdisciplinary field of scholars interested in the origins of racism and how it is reflected in contemporary life. She also said that people who are its biggest opponents don't read the substance of the material. It is said in the Providence Journal article I have cited here that because these scholars are comfortable talking about racist practice affecting wealth and power in the United States, critics feel threatened that marginalized groups are coming to their land.
So what can specifically be done to combat vaccine hesitancy and the misinformation surrounding that? So research into information about pneumonia vaccines has shown that people are more likely to get vaccinated when they're targeted with messages about how it's a duty to protect not only the health of themselves, but that of their friends and family. Another thing that would help would be increasing funding for social programs in healthcare to try and make public health a collective endeavor once again. And then addressing specific concerns such as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine with the side effects that people are worried about with that, and addressing the emergency use authorization of these vaccines and kind of explaining what that means and that these vaccines are still safe. This is a graphic from the CDC on how to address vaccine misinformation. So there's information about leading with the fact and then giving a warning about misinformation, explaining what the misinformation is and whether or not it was done on purpose or on accident, why the facts could have been misinterpreted, and then finally sharing actual facts and correcting the information, providing a correction, and make the correct information more memorable than the misinformation was.